I personally always just want to thank you all for letting me come to talk to you. And I want to say a special thank you to this group. I always love coming to speak to service group organizations. And whenever you go and meet with different groups, and obviously I'm given the opportunity and the blessing to get to meet with a lot of different groups, but when you meet with the service group organization, there's always a different feel, there's always a different personality, and I always enjoy meeting with the service groups because there's such a compassionate heart in those groups. As we talk today about raising money for the United Way, raising money in an economic depression or recession, whichever way you want to say it, can always be difficult. And so I'm reminded of an old joke of an old woman and an old man that had gone to a state fair, and they were walking along the state fair, and they came to a place where there was a gentleman who was giving airplane rides, and the airplane ride cost $5, and the old woman had never been on an airplane ride, and so she began to beg her husband, please, just before I die, I want to go on an airplane ride, it's only $5. And the old man looked at her and says, only $5? He says, $5 is $5. I'm not taking you on an airplane ride. So this went on and on and on for 5 or 10 minutes. And finally the pilot, he lands and he comes in and he hears the debate. He feels sorry for the old woman. And he says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to try to induce the old man to take her on a ride. He says, if you two will come ride on me with my airplane, if you do not say a word during the flight, I will not charge you. Oh. So the old man said, deal. So they take off in the airplane. It's one of these where you sit behind the pilot, small aircraft, and kind of an old-fashioned pre-World War II aircraft. And they go up and they fly, and sure enough, they didn't say anything on takeoff. So the pilot gets creative, and he does a big barrel roll. And then he does a second barrel roll, and he doesn't hear a peep out of him, and he's shocked. So finally he does a big loop, and then a second big loop. Still he doesn't hear a word out of him. Well, he's afraid to get more aggressive, so finally he eventually lands his plane. He turns around and looks at the old man, and he says, well, I got to hand it to you. You didn't hear a peep. I guess your ride was free. And the old man looked at him and he said, yeah, when Ethel fell out in that second barrel roll, I almost said something. But doggone it, $5 is still $5. Times can be tough. I can remember hearing my grandmother and my grandfather speak about the Great Depression. Grandmother and grandfather were married on October 31st of 1933, right in the middle of the Great Depression. And there was no money for a wedding, and like many people did in those days, they simply walked down with their family members to the JP, and I think it was the middle of the week, and they were married. And they walked down to the Brown County Courthouse, was where they got married, and my grandfather at the time had $2 silver in his pocket. And that was all the money they had in the world. My grandmother literally had nothing. And for years and years and years, my grandmother kept those $2 silver. In fact, I think my father still has them, the original $2 silver that were in his pocket. Because $2 in the Great Depression may not sound like much to us, but it was a lot more than some people had. And so they began their career, and somehow they survived through that Great Depression. The truth is, though, my grandfather did have a job. And because he had a job, he was one of the lucky ones. During the Depression, unemployment reached 25%. And think about that for a second. Right now, we're really hurting because our nationwide unemployment is about 8.5% to 9%. During the Great Depression, it exceeded 25%. There was a significant deflation in prices. For example, the price that a farmer could earn for his crops dropped over 60%. So the farmers lost 60% of their income. To give you another example of how bad times have become, when President Roosevelt took office at noon on March 4th of 1933, the respective governors of all 50 states had closed every bank in the nation. No one could withdraw a check or even get to their savings. It's a difficult time. In the year that my grandparents were married in 1933, FDR proposed and Congress passed for the first time the New Deal legislation. FDR's New Deal is largely considered to be the first time our federal government used Keynesian economics or engaged in social spending. Over the years, many people have debated whether or not the New Deal legislation actually got us out of the Depression. I'm sure you've all heard that debate. Many will tell you that it was the Great War that got us out of the Depression. Others still credit the New Deal legislation, and that can be debated by the economists. I know this. I know my grandparents had no doubt about it. For like many people in that, as far as I know, my grandfather always voted a straight Democratic ticket, and he did so because he largely believed that the Democrats got us out of the Great Depression. And I don't say that to say that any kind of political ambition whatsoever, other than to simply say that they viewed it as FDR having saved them from the Great Depression. I once heard a man, I was listening to an economic debate. People were interviewing different folks about whether or not the New Deal legislation got us out of the Depression, and there was a gentleman that was interviewed, and he said this. He said, I don't know whether the New Deal legislation had an impact or got us out of the Depression, but it gave us hope, and before, there was no hope. Of course, media, people, and probably myself included, have often criticized the New Deal legislation. Many people look at the New Deal legislation and say that, that's where our problems began with debt spending, and that because of the New Deal legislation and programs like it that followed, we have an increased national debt and an increased tax burden. Some of those points may be valid, but I think if we're going to really think about it, we have to ask ourselves, if we're not going to support New Deal type legislation or socialistic spending or governmental spending, then where will people find hope? Where will people find help? Well, that's where the United Way comes in. United Way literally provides hope and help to millions of Americans and thousands of people in our community every day. The Brown County United Way helps fund several organizations in our community that are very instrumental to our success. Give you a few. I know they were named off earlier, but I'm going to emphasize them again. The Boys and Girls Club, the Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, Latchkey, 4-H, and Small World Child Development Center. All of those organizations benefit our children. The American Red Cross, the ARC, CASA, Family Service Center, and the Salvation Army, all of those support our families. The Mid-Tex Council on Alcohol and Drug Abuse, the Cancer Service Network, and the Brown County Association for Retarded Citizens. Each of these entities provides an incredible service to our community that largely prevents the government from having to address it. Here's the biggest difference when we talk about the kind of organizations in this room versus the federal government. When the federal government imposes programs versus the private sector, here's the biggest difference. Unlike federal legislation that would probably be aimed and have its greatest impact and its greatest spending in the largest cities in our nation, the impact of the United Way is local. It impacts directly only on our community. It does not increase our taxes, and most importantly to me, programs that are created inside our community are able to provide value-based assistance, meaning they actually help people on their feet, but also do it in a way that provides value to their lives. I was probably pretty idealistic when I was young and coming out of Abilene Christian. Abilene Christian, not unlike Baylor, is a pretty conservative economic education, and like a lot of us, we're taught in a very idealistic way. And I can remember thinking as I grew up that somehow I had kind of earned my status in life. And I remember probably when I first went to law school, I was a new college graduate in my first year of law school, and I was thinking, I've really accomplished something because I graduated high school, I graduated college, I did well enough to get into law school, and was sort of proud of myself in that regard. And then my wife got her first teaching job. And her first teaching job changed my perspective a little bit on the world in this regard. I went to her, she taught first grade, and I went to her first grade classroom. And I gotta back up for a minute. This is my perspective prior to this point in time. Everybody gets an opportunity to have an education in America. Everyone has an opportunity. We all start kindergarten at the same time, and those who work hard advance, and those who don't work hard don't. Well, when my wife taught first grade, she walked in the first day, and on one side of the room, she had a young man that every day wore khaki pants and a button-up shirt, and he could read the newspaper in the first grade. Every word for word, knew every word that was there. On the other side of the room, there was a little girl who didn't know the alphabet, who rarely came in clean clothes, who was usually distraught for some emotional reason in her life. And it occurred to me for the first time in my life, really, maybe I'm shameful to say that at 22 years old, 23 years old, that it hadn't occurred to me that not all of us get an equal chance in life. So I've come to realize, in large part, that most of my success in life was purely an accident of birth. I like to think I worked hard along the way some parts too. But largely, it's an accident of birth. My wife knows, she'd laugh if I was here because she knows I love to quote the speech, but I love Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And when I was in Washington about 3 or 4 months ago now, I made it a point to go to the Lincoln Memorial, which I always try to do when I'm in Washington, and went over to the Lincoln Memorial and sat there an hour and read the Gettysburg Address and looked at those things. But you know, the famous beginning is, 87 years ago, our forefathers set forth in this continent a new nation, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I know what he meant. I know the time in which he wrote it. And I do believe that every person and every soul in this life should have an equal opportunity. But I don't necessarily believe that all of us get an equal shake in life, because some of us don't. There are some in our community who were not blessed the way that I was blessed. There are some in our community who were not given the opportunity that I was given. Here's one of the things I like the most about the United Way. Bert told me when I was first elected mayor, he and I were having a conversation. We were sitting by, and he said, "Stephen, you got one rule." He said, "You can't make every event, and you can't give to every cause." And a lot of you can relate to that, because I see a lot of community leaders in this room, and there's a lot of you who get approached to attend or contribute to every event. One of the things I like the most about the United Way is I'm going to call it one-stop shop, for lack of a better term. I don't know if that's a good term or not. Maybe offensive to the United Way folks.
No, please do.
All right. Is the ability to give a single contribution and know that it's going to have an impact across our county and all the different organizations that do such great work for our youth and our families. Because what's difficult, obviously, is to write a different check to each of those entities. Sometimes it's just not possible. But you can write that one check to the United Way, and it can have an incredible story. Several years ago, when I was still working in Dallas-Fort Worth, I had a friend who was the president of the American Cancer Society in Fort Worth. And as we were meeting one day for lunch, she mentioned to me, she said, "Hey, what's going on in Brownwood?" And I said, "I don't know, why?" She said, "Well," she said, "Brownwood American Cancer Society donations were twice the combined amount of Abilene and San Angelo." And I got to tell you, I don't know, I couldn't give her an answer for why that was the case. But obviously I felt a great sense of pride being from Brownwood and knowing that we were being looked at by people outside of the world as a generous people. Recently somebody asked me to kind of support a cause, and it was a difficult request, and this is why. If any of you were involved in it, you'll probably figure out the facts, but the gist of it was we were applying for a grant, and the grant was trying to get funding, and so whoever was writing the grant and wrote a phrase that says something like this. I'm going to paraphrase, I'm going to make it sound worse than it was. But the gist of it was, everyone that lives in Brownwood lives in poverty. That was basically the gist of the wording of it. And it made us sound, beyond poor. It made us sound like this was the worst place to live in America. And so obviously, as mayor, I found it a little bit hard to endorse publicly this over-the-top description that had been written for this particular event. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Brownwood is probably statistically not as well off as a lot of other places in the world. But what I know is we also have a lot of people that have been exceedingly blessed, as have I. Leave you with this thought. Times are tough. And they're tough for all of us. But anyone can give out of an abundance. But only the extraordinary give when they really can't afford it. Only the extraordinary give when they really can't afford it. We have an opportunity in a united way to campaign to be looked at by people across the world as an overly generous people. Maybe we're not the most wealthy community on the face of the earth, but we can be proportionately the most generous. Let us strive to be an extraordinary people. Thank you.